Welcome to Board Certified, expert interview episodes about medical licensing exams and healthcare careers. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we offer affordable adaptive online prep courses for the USMLE Step 1, MCAT, PTCE, and PTE, and other exams like those. We have everything you need to succeed, including comprehensive study guides, video lessons, thousands of practice questions powered by our memory enhancing space repetition algorithm, and full length practice exams. You can try us out for free at achievable.me. And if you like it, use code podcast to save 10%. Now, let's get started. Today, we've got Shirag Shemmassian from Shemmassian Consulting, and I'd love if you could introduce yourself and your company.
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, I'm Shirag Shemmassian, been assisting students with medical school admissions for over 20 years. And we assist with every aspect of pre-med advising, including what extracurricular activities to participate in, what courses to enroll in, one-on-one MCAT preparation, as well as application assistance. And I'm excited to chat with you about the MCAT. And people can find us at shemmassianconsulting.com or shemmassian.com, routes you to the same place. Shemmassian, if you're wondering how to spell that, I would too. It's SHEMMASSIAN.com.
Yeah, three S's and two M's is kind of, I think that's what I would look at.
Yeah, if you're
Well,
someone doing a
great.
spelling bee, you know what to use now.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. And, I think for today, my thought is this episode is about kind of answering the commonly, frequently asked questions related to the MCAT, right? I think, if you're here, you probably know already that the MCAT is the medical school admissions test. That's literally what the letters stand for. So you are hoping to basically go to graduate school and head towards being something in the medical or healthcare profession, oftentimes a medical doctor or MD. And so, where do you want to start with us? Maybe we start with the process and how to get ready to prep for the test and when you should start in the application process. Like, okay, applications are due at this date. When do you start preparing for your test so you can have the test scores you need by then?
Yeah, let's talk about, I'll give an overview on the MCAT and I'll transition to good times to take the MCAT so that we can have the right framework for our discussion. So the MCAT is a really difficult standardized exam. A lot of people consider it to be the most difficult entry or standardized testing exam for admissions purposes. It's around 7+ hours in length. It comprises 4 sections. First section is Chem Phys, so chemistry and physics. The next one is CARS, which is essentially reading comprehension. The third is Biochem. And the fourth is Psych Soc, or psychology and sociology. And each of the 4 sections are equally weighted. The highest score you can get is a 132, and it's scored out of a 528 in total. It's a weird scoring system. And just for people's knowledge, the average score across all test takers is around a 500 to a 501. And then the average or the matriculant median score for MD programs is around the 511, around the 506 for osteopathic programs. These things can shift slightly from time to time, but it's going to be around there. And so it's a tough exam. And what does the 511 correspond to? It's in the 70s in terms of the percentile score. So you have to achieve well above average in order to be around the matriculant median for allopathic, i.e. MD programs. As far as when to take the exam, it's a good question. So let's say you apply to medical school. You're going to apply around between May to July in a given year. Okay. And that's because there's a primary application submission. Primary applications will open in May. These are the centralized application systems, and each school has their school specific supplemental applications, and those are usually submitted in July. So then where does that put your MCAT? So let's say that I'm applying to medical school in 2025. So I would submit my primary application in May of 2025 or early June 2025, but I needed to have taken my MCAT either, and this is ideal, there's a lot of flexibility here, but the ideal is you either take it the summer before you apply to medical school. So if I'm submitting my application in 2025, I would have wanted to take it in summer 2024 or the early part of 2025. So ideally January to March of my application year. Okay. So that's how it would work. And the reason is because It's nice if you can hit your goal score the first time. It's really nice to get it out of the way and focus on the application materials. There are a ton of them, ton of essays you're going to write. So getting the MCAT out of the way is really nice. The other reason why you might want to take it early is because if you don't get your goal score the first time and you need to retake, you still have time to retake. And medical school admissions operates on a rolling basis. So the earlier you submit your application materials, the earlier you have your final MCAT score, the better it is for you and for your admissions prospects. And so let's say that you waited until April of 2025 to take your exam, you get your score back in May. Now you're going to want to retake. You're going to want to probably have a couple months to study for the retake, but now your retake is competing with your application writing efforts, and it can all come to a head at the same time. And so the more you can get ahead of it, the more you'll thank your past self.
Yeah. I'm curious also, I mean, you mentioned that it's kind of rolling applications, but uh, am I naive in thinking that medical schools still operate on kind of a semester basis, or is that not the case?
Not quite. So medical schools themselves, they have different subject areas. So they might have, let's say, for the next 6 weeks, we're studying neurology or something like that. So that's how the medical school academic calendar operates. But the way medical school admissions operates is you apply 1 year before you actually begin medical school. So let's say I'm looking to start medical school in 2026, so around like August 2026. I'm applying to med school the year prior. And so that's how they evaluate applications. The applications are submitted in the summer. Interviews can come in late summer through the fall. There's usually a little bit of a lull between November and December. And then there's a second round of interview invitations sent out at the start of the new year. And those can go into the early spring typically. And admissions decisions can come all the way through May. Even some might even come in June. Those are pretty rare, but it can happen.
Yeah, so that was the thrust of my question, though. That is like a typical timeline, right? So if you apply in, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the worst possible time, like December or something, it's not like you're going to start school the following December. You would still start around August.
Correct. Irrespective of when in a cycle you submit your application, the start date for medical school remains the same. So you don't start school a year after you apply. You're starting school in essentially late July or sometime in August of the following year. So you apply during the calendar year prior.
Great. Yeah, so given all that, then basically you probably need to back out that whole schedule for the year. How much time, how many weeks or months should you be allocating to your first MCAT prep session? And then what percentage of people take a second one? And how much should you account for that?
Yeah. So how much you should prep depends on a few factors. One factor is how well you did in your science courses. So if you have a really strong command of biology and biochemistry and chemistry and physics and all these things, then your content preparation phase, in other words, where you're learning the actual material that the MCAT tests you on, that might be a little bit shorter. But then if you struggled academically, let's say in chemistry, and you need to devote more time, maybe you need to devote more total hours. You also want to think about when you're prepping. So if I'm devoting a full summer, 3 to 4 months, and I can devote more or less full-time effort, I might need fewer months to prep for the exam. Versus if I'm prepping during the academic semester, I might need to prep for more months because I can't devote as many hours per week as I would have been able to if I were prepping over the summer. I think for a first time attempt, like if I'm just starting my MCAT prep from the beginning, I would say 3 to 4 months is a good sweet spot for a lot of students. If I'm doing a portion of it during my academic term, I would say 6 months might be something to consider. Typically, we like to see up to 9 months. And I say it that way because when you stretch it out too much, like beyond 6 months especially, we start to think about atrophy, essentially forgetting what you learned earlier in your preparation process. So with 3 to 4 months, that's less of a risk. But if you get to the 6, certainly beyond 6, that starts to be a concern. So you need to build in refreshers of the things that you learned in months 1 and 2, let's say. And so that's how I would think
Mhm.
about it. I think about it as, hey, I want to prep ideally 350 total hours on the low end, maybe 500 hours on the high end. And then I say, okay, how many weeks do I have until the exam? So divide the total tutoring, like the total preparation hours, by the number of weeks. That gives me a pretty good sense of hours per week. Now, the hours per week, do I want to do it across 5 days or 6 days or 7 days? And that will give you a good sense of how many hours per day I should be prepping roughly.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioning atrophy, it's probably a big part of the reason why the medical community uses spaced repetition so much, right? I mean, Achievable, we bake it into our prep platform, but I'm sure that many people who are listening to this have also heard of Anki, which is a free open source platform that you can also do the same thing. It's very important to remember everything. You're going to
You
be
would think.
learning a lot. Well, I mean, it's like you said, much more challenging than a lot of other professions. And I'm curious with basically you were talking about the 3 to 4 months to prep, or if you're still in school, 6 months. Do you feel like this is maybe a case, and we don't need to, gap years are a whole nother topic, but like, is this the reason why a lot of people take a gap year before they apply to medical school because doing it your senior year of college is such a pain?
Yeah. So if you're going to apply to med school without a gap year, you're going to apply the summer following your junior year. And so, thinking about our ideal testing dates, that means the summer before is the summer after sophomore year. So, that's right after completing your prereqs, which is nice because the material is fresh, but sometimes it feels rushed for some students. Or if you were going to take it like January of junior year. So, sometimes students are like, how do people get it done and apply straight through? Most people come to college thinking they're going to apply to med school straight through. Most people end up not applying to med school straight through. Essentially, what happens is sometime during years one, and more likely year two or three, they look down the road and they're like, what? I was supposed to have how much research, how much clinical, how much service experience? I was supposed to study for how many months for this MCAT? Like doing all of this in this amount of time, it's pretty wild. And so that's what leads to gap years. Or there's within the pre med community, people look to their peers and they oftentimes see so and is taking a gap year and they seem to know something I don't. So maybe I should take a gap year too. So there is that kind of behavior that we observe all the time. But when we start to prep students early on in this process, like when we start to work with students year one, year two, it's pretty straightforward for us to help them develop the right academic and extracurricular plan where they're not having to take a gap year or two. And so that ends up being very aligned with their original goal. And they can always make that decision later, but I always like to support students in a way that at least leaves the door open for them to take that, to apply straight through should they choose to.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And at that point, once you're like, okay, it's time for me to sit down and prepare. I mean, what are kind of the different ways that you can prepare, right? I mean, certainly there's online self-study courses, there's getting a book, there's doing like some sort of class, either online or offline. Or do people do a mix of these things? What's the typical way that this happens?
Yeah, look, there are a lot of different ways to do it and different permutations, but I think of it as there being three main categories for MCAT preparation. You've got the DIY. This is I'm going to purchase a set of content materials, whether it's a book set or a digital library of content materials, and study that, and I'll get a question bank and some practice exams, and I'm just going to DIY it. I think that's an effective way for students who are real natural standardized test takers that can very easily identify their patterns of errors and intervene. It's not a huge subset of the pre-med community, but it is the cheapest. So if students are particularly cost conscious, then that might be a way they go. Others will prep with, let's call it a semi-structured approach, where they're joining a group class. And that's nice because someone is providing more structure, there's some accountability. And, that one, from a cost perspective, it's in the middle. And that's for students who want some structure and accountability. But the downside is you're not getting personalization. They might go through the content in a way that's giving equal attention to areas that are super high yield and not so high yield, in areas that you're really strong already, or in areas where you're a little bit weaker. And so it doesn't have that customization. And then you've got the third level, which is one-on-one tutoring, which is, of course, highest in terms of the required financial investment, but also the most custom. And so if a student is really focused on, I just want to do this once, I want to do it right, I want to be there in the trenches with me, someone really tailoring this experience for me, that's what you're going to go for. And all of them can work depending on the person, but that's how I think about it. But regardless of how you prep, I think there are a few things that everyone must have access to. They must have content resources of some kind. If you're doing like a group course or one-on-one tutoring, it's usually provided to you. So you should definitely have content materials. You should have a question bank, a really good question bank, and you should have full-length practice exams. Obviously, the one that everyone uses is the AMC official materials because that's the one published by the test producers. So those three things have to be there. And I would add on to there a very clear and tailored study schedule so that you're not just reading books ad nauseum, taking practice questions, saying, oh, I missed a question on acids and bases. I guess I got to study acids and bases, because there's the content portion of it and there's also the strategy portion of it. You might know a content area, but you're not sure how to apply that information for the purposes of the exam. Those are two very different things. You can have deep understanding of a specific knowledge area, but have a very hard time applying it. And so both of those things have to come into play when you prep.
Yeah, and I'm curious, one of the first things that comes to mind is with the official materials and the official exams, I'm pretty familiar with like the GRE, where ETS has a limited number of these official exams that you can buy, right? I think it's 6. So you almost build your whole prep plan around it. Like you maybe take one at the very beginning to set a baseline, and then you use them roughly kind of every fifth of the way through the course, and you do 2 at the end. Or that's an example, but it's like you have to build your prep program around these official tests because obviously the people that make the real tests are going to be the ones that make the most accurate practice tests. So is that also similar for the AMC official test?
I would say yes, overall. Now, I don't recommend that a student use up one of their official practice exams in the beginning, because they're
Yeah, it's a
very
little different
precious. Yeah, it's a
for
very
those. Yeah.
precious resource. And typically what students are doing is they're using the official practice exams during the weeks leading up to the exam. So you'll maybe take one a week during the final weeks leading up to your exam to get the best gauge. And you can use a different full length exam earlier. Although I should say that some test prep outfits will make those initial, like their full length exams, especially difficult. I think part of it is to spook you and into thinking, oh my gosh, I got a really low score. Maybe I should sign up for their service kind of thing. So be mindful of that. It's probably a slight underestimate of your starting place. But hey, if that serves to motivate you to study better, study harder, then I'm all for it.
Great. Yeah. So now I'd love to talk a little bit about, okay, so you're taking this thing and you get your scores back, right? So you mentioned it a bit at the beginning, 500 is kind of average. 511 is maybe the threshold you want to be hitting for the MD program. So that's 70th percentile, things like that. Out of a 528 total score, it's interesting that all the numbers are so close to perfect. At least that's how it feels to me as sort of an outsider. Is that basically because in order to get to, say, a 511, you need to be getting less than 10 questions wrong? Or is it more that that's just how the grading scale works?
Yeah, great question. And there are several things in there that I want to address. So let's go back and talk about matriculant median scores. So if you look across all MD programs across the United States, of course, there are schools in Canada and all that kind of stuff as well. But across the MD programs in the US, you've got a matriculant median GPA of a 3.7 and an
Mhm.
MCAT of 511. Okay. So these are medians, meaning 50% of people who got in had a score above, 50% of people had a score below. Because you used a very interesting word there, Tyler. You used the word threshold. And median, when you talk to a student about medians, they understand intellectually what that means. But emotionally, when we're feeling really anxious about our admissions prospects, we start to view a median as a threshold. So students start to think,
I see what you're
well, I have a
saying. Yeah.
3.7, but a 508. Does that mean I have no chance? I was like, let's go back to what a median means, because half the students had a score above, half the students had a score below, right? So that's always a very important discussion to have, because essentially the higher your numbers are, the better your prospects, and your prospects are also higher at the more competitive schools. And the lower your stats, the lower your overall prospects, and certain schools may be out of range for you. So, a really valuable tool for students to evaluate where they stand relative to what a school looks for is MSAR or MSAR. It's about $28 per year at the time of this recording, where students can look at a given school. What is the total MCAT median? What is the 25th percentile at that school among people who got in? What's the 10th percentile? What's the 75th? What's the 90th? So, not just am I above or below median, but where am I on that spectrum of students who get into that school? And so, let's say that your MCAT's a little bit lower than what a school typically looks for, but your GPA is well above. That might balance out. So, we look at that, right? But then there are other kinds of questions around what score to aim for, because we talked about averages across all schools, across all demographics. If you look at a Harvard, obviously their matriculate median GPA is going to be 3.9 plus, 3.9 GPA or above, or maybe an MCAT in the 520s, 520, 521, 522. But there's also demographic factors that play a role. So we talked about all demographics. But if I'm, say, an Asian applicant, now my matriculate median for my demographic group is a 3.8, 514. So what I need to score may depend on where I went to school. So if I go to a more prestigious undergrad, my GPA may carry more weight. What state I'm from, because certain states' public medical schools are harder to get into than other states. We might think about my demographic group. We might think about how many schools I'm going to apply to. The wider net that I cast, probabilistically speaking, I have higher chances. So all of these kinds of things come into play. And we have to think about that when asking the question of what do I actually need to get? But you're absolutely right that even achieving the median score for matriculants is no easy feat. And so if you start to look at, okay, you're starting to look at the med school list and you start to see all these MD programs, man, they want like a 514, 515 or above. What does that correspond to? 514 is like 88th percentile oftentimes. 515 is around the 90th. So these are not easy scores to come by. And it could lead easily to a feeling of, gosh, like the average student who's getting in is almost better than every student taking this test. That's wild. And that can be very
Isn't it?
discouraging to people, which is why we have to take a step back and say, okay, cool. It is hard. No one's going to say it's not, or if they do, then we should maybe look elsewhere for assistance. But how do we actually get there and breaking it down day by day and then working towards that goal score? And also we have to mind, okay, let's actually aim to get a higher score than even what we've set as our baseline score, because sometimes on test day we get anxious. Maybe we have a couple points below what we were performing on those AMC full-length exams. And so even if we drop by 2-3 points, we're still landing in a good place. So a very difficult exam for sure, but it's doable. We see it all the time.
Yeah, I think that's just like good standard advice for any test. Is just you should be aiming above where
Yes.
you think your score should be, because you almost always do a little bit worse than the real thing. I also am curious. I just wanted to circle back on that one part of the question, which is for each section, are you only really able to miss like a couple of things to get a good score? Or is that just the way that the curve works? Because, for instance, to get like a top SAT score, you basically either have to get perfect or close to perfect, like not missing any questions.
So first, let's define what a good score is, right? So we talked about,
Sure.
what the different sections. So it's each section is out of a 132. So it's like a 118 to a 132. And so what's a good score? So going back to MSAR, I said where, every school lists their median scores for students who got in, all that kind of stuff. Essentially, the 50th percentile score for a given section among people who got in is almost always a 126 or above in each given section. Obviously, the more prestigious the school, the higher it is. And then if you do a 128 or above, now I would consider that a good score overall. Of course, it's all relative. If you're looking to go to Stanford Med School, 128 in each section might not cut it because that's going to give you a 512. But I would say that's what we're looking at. But you're right. You can only miss a handful of questions to get that kind of score. So ideally, you want to have at least a few sections that are a 130 or above. If you're doing a 129 in all 4 sections, now we're looking at a 516, which is above a 90th percentile kind of score. So yeah, not a lot of room for error, especially when you're going for those higher and higher scores. Now, once you get to the like 520 range and above, it's one of those things where you could have gotten a 526 one day, a 522 one day. It's almost like the ball didn't bounce your direction that day because you might get one question that's especially tough, or you misread something and you got the wrong answer. So at that level, scores are more or less viewed the same way because you could have just as easily gotten a 522 as a 524 kind of thing.
Great. Yeah, and then I'm curious kind of how do you recommend people tackle inconsistent section scores, right? Where maybe one section's a good bit lower than the others. Does the MCAT allow super scoring, which is where you can take it twice and take the best scores from each section and combine them? Yeah, how do you handle that?
Yeah. Okay. So the medical school application requires that all scores be published and reflected on your actual application. So you can't do score choice, unlike with most colleges. So they'll see all exams, all section scores, and the dates of those exams. Now, can you superscore? You can't, but some schools may choose to superscore your scores. It's pretty rare. Some schools will say, we'll take the most recent. Again, pretty rare. Most schools will say they look at the highest. Now, that doesn't mean they unsee the lower scores, but they officially kind of factor the highest score into their admissions decisions. So that's how it works. Now, inconsistent section scores, really good question. Let's talk about, first of all, which sections tend to be lowest for students who have inconsistent scores. Number one is cars. In other words, if I met a student and they said to me, one of my sections was lower than the others, most of the time, it's cars. I would say the second most common is Chem Phys. Not surprising because you've got a lot of life science majors who are stronger in biochem than in the chemical and natural sciences and things like that, physical sciences, right? So that's the most common. Sometimes people think that psych soc is the easiest. It is for some people. It's not for others because it's not an area that students are devoting a lot of time to, right? So we have to think about this question. Now, your total score is most important. So even if you have some discrepancy across sections, but your total score is competitive, that's far more important than a section score. But like sometimes you'll see a student freak out saying, my score is a 515, but I got a 125 in cars. Am I doomed? No, not necessarily. So we'll have to think about it based on the different schools. Now, the pattern of your scores is also telling. So think about it where Chem Phys, Biochem, and Psych Soc have a scientific component. There's content you need to know to answer the questions correctly. So it's content plus strategy. What's unique about cars? There is no content. It's not like there is science involved in it. There's no core material to study. It's pure strategy. So if I'm a student where I'm doing decently well on Chem Phys, Biochem, and Psych Soc, but not on cars, that is a very good way to diagnose a strategy weakness. Essentially, I have no content knowledge to lean on to lift my scores. And so it's a pure strategy weakness I need to address. That's how I would do it. And the nice thing about addressing cars in that way is when you figure out strategy for cars, that same strategy lifts the other section scores as well. So it's a rising tide lifts all boats saying. And so that's how I would treat it. Now, if I'm doing well on cars, but struggling on, say, Psych Soc or Biochem or whatever, that's a pretty good indication that my strategy is fine overall, but I have some serious content gaps, or I'm not able to apply that content effectively. So a pattern of scores is actually in some like the silver lining to that inconsistent section scores is that it's actually a very helpful diagnostic tool on how to revisit my preparation approach.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that basically because these different areas or sections correspond to your skills to an extent, it's almost like a little bit of a mind map, which is, I'm sure, how the schools kind of look at it too.
Yeah, for sure.
So then my last question is, there are rumors. People love to say different things like psych social is getting harder, or that the AMC practice exams are not as representative of the real tests as they used to be, or things like that. Do you think there's any validity to any of these rumors? And just in general, how do you handle that kind of gossip when you're studying for this thing?
Yeah. So here's the thing. Regardless of how it's perceived by some people, I think the study approach shouldn't change. So you want to stick to the basics in terms of having very strong content foundation and learning how to apply it strategically. That has always worked. It will always continue to work. Yeah, so there will be times where students will struggle with a certain section that they expected to do well on. Psych is a very common example. And so in hindsight, what how they'll view it is, man, like the psych section was very different from the practice exams that I took. And so those weren't as representative. So it's a way to explain in hindsight why your scores shook out the way that they did. I've not observed something objectively different about the MCAT today than the MCAT 2 years ago. So it's hard to say for sure because I also see students doing exceptionally well on all four sections today, just as I did a few years ago as well. I wouldn't get too caught up in them because honestly, what's the value? Even if we said, yeah, this section's harder today. Okay. And you can devote a little bit more time, sure. But fundamentally, the exam doesn't change. So I wouldn't put too much stock in it.
Great. Is there anything we haven't covered yet that you want to make sure we touched on before we wrap up?
The MCAT is its own universe, and I'm sure that students will send in questions. But I think in terms of the higher level, how to understand the exam, how to understand scores and what they aim for, and proven strategies, I think this was a great conversation, and I'm really honored to be with y'all.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been Board Certified, hosted by Tyler and Cassandra from Achievable, with Shirag Shemmassian from Shemmassian Consulting. And Achievable has great online courses for the USMLE Step 1, MCAT, PTCE, NPTE, and other similar exams. And you can try them out for free by going to achievable.me.